The Midnight Express. The night was unusually still when Ethan boarded the Midnight Express. The city was quiet, its streets empty, and the only sound that filled the air was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The train station, typically bustling with passengers at this hour, was eerily deserted. The station clock ticked away, its hands frozen at precisely midnight. But Ethan didn't mind the silence. In fact, he found it calming, a perfect end to a long and tiring day. Ethan had always been the curious type. He loved unraveling mysteries, and tonight he was determined to solve the mystery of the Midnight Express, an old legend that had been passed down from generation to generation. Locals claimed that the Midnight Express appeared out of nowhere during a full moon, and anyone who boarded it would never return. It was said to be a train that didn't just travel through the countryside. It traveled through time itself, or perhaps even through dimensions. Some believed it was the train to the afterlife. Others thought it was a cursed relic from a forgotten era. But one thing was certain. No one who had ever gotten on that train was ever seen again. As Ethan stood on the platform waiting for the train, the wind picked up. It seemed to carry with it an ominous chill, as though nature itself was warning him not to board. He looked around, but the platform was still empty. There were no other passengers in sight. Perhaps, he thought, they were all just afraid to board, letting the train pass by unchallenged. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of train wheels on the tracks. It grew louder, growing closer, and Ethan turned toward the source of the sound. In the distance, through the misty night, he saw it, the Midnight Express. It was a sight to behold. The train, as it came closer, seemed almost otherworldly. Its sleek black body gleamed under the full moon, and the golden lights inside flickered like a distant star. But what stood out the most was the eerie silence that surrounded it. There were no sounds of people talking, no rumbles of luggage, no laughter or excitement typical of train journeys. Just a haunting, profound stillness. As the train came to a halt in front of him, Ethan's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and fear. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The train doors opened slowly, and Ethan stepped aboard. The first thing that struck him was the cold air that rushed past him as he entered the train. It wasn't the usual coolness of a train that had been sitting idle in the night air. This felt different. Almost unnatural, as though the temperature had dropped well below freezing. Ethan walked down the long, narrow corridor of the train, his footsteps echoing in the silence. There were no other passengers in sight. The interior of the train was grand, yet strangely dim. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the soft glow of antique lamps illuminated the path ahead. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though no one was there. He passed by several compartments, all seemingly empty. But as he reached the end of the corridor, he felt something strange. There was an unmistakable presence in the air. It felt as though he was not alone, even though the compartment he had reached appeared empty. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside. It was a luxurious compartment, far more lavish than any train he had ever been on. The seats were covered in velvet, and the carpet beneath his feet felt soft and plush. There was an old-fashioned brass clock on the wall that ticked slowly, its hands moving with an odd rhythm. The window beside him was covered in thick curtains, but as the train started moving again, Ethan pulled them back to reveal the view outside. To his surprise, there was no passing scenery. The landscape outside wasn't the usual stretch of countryside or city skyline. It was dark, utterly dark, as if the train was traveling through a black void. There were no stars in the sky, no distant lights to indicate civilization, just an endless abyss. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he shrugged it off as just his imagination. He sat down in one of the velvet chairs and tried to calm his nerves. The air inside the compartment was unnaturally cold, but the train was moving at a steady pace, its wheels clicking rhythmically against the tracks. Minutes passed, then hours. The train sped through the darkness, but time seemed to stretch in odd ways. The clock on the wall ticked slower and slower, as if mocking the very concept of time itself. Ethan tried to stand, but his body felt heavy, as though the very act of movement had become a struggle. Suddenly, the door to the compartment creaked open. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, a tall, thin man with pale skin and sharp, piercing eyes. He wore an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, complete with a brass cap. The man's gaze was fixed on Ethan, his expression unreadable. "Is everything all right, sir?" the conductor asked, his voice soft but unsettlingly deep. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, everything's fine. I'm just trying to adjust to the journey." The conductor didn't move or speak again, instead stepping back and allowing the door to close behind him. But as he left, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the conductor had been watching him for far too long. His eyes filled with a strange, knowing gaze. The train continued to move through the void. Hours passed, or was it days? Time had lost all meaning, and the more Ethan tried to figure it out, the more confused he became. His mind raced as he tried to recall the exact moment he had boarded the train, but the memories felt foggy, distant. The clock on the wall had stopped ticking, and the air was growing even colder. He rose from his seat and went to the window again, desperate for some sign of life. But there was nothing but the infinite darkness. No stars, no moon, no land, just an endless expanse of blackness stretching on forever. Panic began to set in. What was happening? Where was he going? And most importantly, why couldn't he get off the train? That's when it hit him, the realization that shook him to his core. He was never meant to leave the Midnight Express. The train wasn't just taking him on a physical journey, it was taking him somewhere far darker, somewhere beyond the reach of reality. It was as if the train had become a gateway, a bridge to another world. A world where the laws of time and space didn't apply. A world where passengers boarded but never disembarked. In his desperation, Ethan pounded on the door, shouting for help. But there was no answer. No one came. He turned to the window, hoping for some sign of life, some clue to his surroundings. But all he could see was the dark void. The train was never stopping. Ethan rushed to the door again, desperately trying to open it. But as his hand gripped the cold metal handle, he felt a sharp pull, as if something invisible was holding him back. And then, just as suddenly, the train came to a stop. The eerie silence that had been with him for so long suddenly broke, and the doors of the compartment slowly creaked open. But when Ethan stepped out, he was no longer in the train. He stood on the edge of a vast, empty desert. The Midnight Express was gone, vanished without a trace. The only thing left behind was the eerie, unsettling silence of the desert. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an unnatural glow over the barren landscape. And then, in the distance, Ethan saw something. A figure. A shadow. The conductor. Ethan tried to run, but his legs were heavy, and his feet sank into the sand. The figure got closer, its form becoming clearer and clearer. The conductor's eyes locked with his, and Ethan could hear his voice once more, deep and resonating. You should have never boarded the Midnight Express, Ethan. Now you're part of its journey forever.